There are paths a man chooses in this life, and there are paths that choose him. And for Levi Holden, the path that chose him began on a gray Tuesday afternoon at a gas station on the dying east side of Brennan, Ohio, when a boy no bigger than a fence post walked up to him holding a single crumpled dollar in his fist like it was the last coin on earth. Levi was 61 years old. He stood 6'4" in his boots, and he carried 260 pounds of scar tissue gristle and hard living on a frame that had stopped apologizing for itself a long time ago. His beard had gone the color of wood smoke. His hands were maps of old fights and older work, and the leather vest across his back carried the patch of the Iron Saints Motorcycle Club, a name that made grown men in 3 counties cross the street when they saw it coming. He had buried friends. He had done time. He had ridden through funerals and floods, and the kind of grief that hollows a man out and leaves him rattling. And in all those years, he had learned to read trouble the way other men read the weather. So when the shadow of the boy fell across his boot, Levi knew before he even looked down that this was a different kind of trouble. Not the kind that came at you. The kind that came to you small and shaking, asking to be carried. He had been laughing low with his road captain, a wiry man named Cole, who everybody called Wire, the two of them topping off their tanks while the rest of the run waited at the pumps. 3 other Iron Saints idled nearby big machines breathing that deep mechanical heartbeat that is the only true church some men ever know. It was an ordinary stop on an ordinary afternoon. And then the boy was there. Levi looked down. The child could not have been more than 8 years old. He was soaking wet from a rain that had quit an hour ago, which meant he had been out in it a long time, and he was thin in a way that made Levi's jaw tighten, thin in the way of a kid who gives the bigger half of everything to someone smaller. He wore a school shirt 2 sizes too large, the collar dark with damp, and his sneakers had been white once a long time ago. His hair was plastered to his forehead. He was trembling so hard he seemed to blur at the edges. But it was the boy's eyes that stopped Levi cold. Because the boy was not looking at the tattoos. He was not staring at the chrome or the leather or the patch the way children usually did, with that wide mix of fear and wonder. This boy was looking straight up into Levi's face with a desperate, drowning focus, the way a man looks at the last rope before the water closes over him. The boy held out the dollar. "Mister," his voice was barely there, a whisper sanded down to almost nothing. "Mister, please." Levi did not take the money. He motioned with 2 fingers, and one by one the engines behind him died, and the sudden silence sat down on all of them like a heavy hand. Then slow, deliberate, a movement that took the better part of 2 seconds, because his knees were 61 years old too. Levi went down on one knee in the wet concrete so that his eyes were level with the boy's. "All right, son," Levi said. His voice was a low, gravel rumble, the kind of voice that could fill a barroom or gentle a frightened animal, and right now he made it the second kind. "I'm listening. Take your time." The boy's chest hitched. He pushed the dollar forward another inch, and his small, dirty hand was shaking so badly the bill quivered like a leaf. "It's all I got," the boy said. $1, but you can have it. All of it. My sister's bus comes at 3:25, and the boys are waiting for her in the alley, and they're going to hurt her this time. They said because she told. The words came faster now, tumbling a dam, giving way. "Please, mister, please. Can you just walk her home just today? Just one time. I'll do anything. I can rake leaves. I can. His voice broke clean in half. "Please, Ades." I don't know who else to ask. $1. A child's entire fortune held out to hire an army. Levi did not look at the money. He looked at the boy's eyes, and what he saw in them was something he recognized from his own bathroom mirror 40 years ago. He saw a child who had been forced to become a guardian before he had ever finished being a kid. He saw the particular exhaustion of someone too young, carrying something too heavy for too long. He had seen that look on his own face once in a different life, before a stranger had reached down and pulled him out of the dark. And the memory of that stranger moved through him now like a draft through an open door. "What's your name, son?" Levi asked. "Eli." A swallow. "Eli Mercer." "All right, Eli Mercer." Levi closed his own scarred hand gently over the boy's, folding the dollar back into the small fist, and he held it there a moment. "Keep your money. We don't take pay for a thing like this. Now I want you to tell me everything, and don't you skip a single piece of it. Who are the boys? Where's the alley? And who's your sister?" It came out above the bar in a flood. His sister's name was June. She was 11. They lived with their grandmother Hazel in the Sycamore Court apartments, 6 blocks over the brick ones on the east side that everybody called the court, and the only way from the school bus stop to their building ran through a narrow dogleg alley behind the old laundromat. For the better part of 2 months, a pack of older boys had owned that alley. 5, 6 of them high school age, led by a tall, mean one named Brett, who made the little kids pay to pass. Lunch money, phone if you had one, whatever you had. If you had nothing, he made you remember it. 2 days ago, June didn't have nothing to give, Eli said, and his eyes filled and spilled over, and he did not wipe them. So they took her backpack and they threw it up on the roof of the laundromat where she couldn't reach, and her homework was in it, and her medicine, and they laughed at her, and she cried the whole walk home. His small jaw set in a way that made him look for one heartbreaking second exactly like a man. She told Grandma, and Grandma called the police. And a cop came and drove past one time and left, and Brett saw it. He saw the cop just drive away, and this morning he found me before school. The boy's voice dropped to almost nothing. He said because June snitched today, they were going to teach her a real lesson. He said she'd be sorry. He said it'd be today. Levi was very still. Beside him, Wire had gone still, too, and the silence among the bikers had changed temperature, the way air changes before a storm. "What time is it now?" Levi said. It was not a question. Wire glanced at his phone. 3:16. "And the bus?" 3:25. Eli whispered. 9 minutes. "They're already there, mister." "I know they are. They're in the alley right now waiting for her." Levi stood up. It took him a moment, the way it always did now, but when he reached his full height, he seemed to keep going up and up, a wall of leather and gray beard, and 40 years of refusing to look away, and Eli tipped his head all the way back to follow him. Levi looked at Wire. He looked past him at the 3 other Iron Saints who had drifted close enough to hear men named Diesel and Tully, and a quiet one called Book, who read scripture at the clubhouse on Sundays and broke knuckles the other 6 days when knuckles needed breaking. Not one of them said a word. They didn't need to. This was the thing under the thing, the reason men like them wore the patch at all, the part nobody believed about them, because the leather scared people too much to ask. The strong have a duty. That was the whole of it. The strong have a duty to stand in front of the weak, and a man who has been weak and remembers it never forgets the debt. "Eli," Levi said, "your sister's getting home safe today. That's a promise from me, and I don't make that kind of promise twice." But even as he said it, the boy's own words were turning over in his chest. The cop drove past one time and left. Walking June home today wouldn't fix anything. It would only buy one day. Brett would be back tomorrow with the bus stop and the alley and the toll, and the Iron Saints would not be there, and a frightened 11-year-old would learn all over again that asking for help only made the lesson worse. So Levi did the thing the original story never could have taught the boy. He decided not to delay the trouble. He decided to redraw the map. He pulled his phone from an inside pocket and dialed a number he had dialed maybe 4 times in 20 years, the number you called when it was real. "It's Levi," he said into it. "I'm at the Sunoco on Delancey and 4th. I'm calling a Broken Arrow." A pause while the voice on the other end said something sharp. "No, it's not a brother, it's a kid. A whole street full of them. I need every patch who isn't pulling a shift to be at the mouth of the alley behind the Edsel laundromat off Sycamore inside 10 minutes. Ride hard, ride loud." He hung up. He looked down at Eli, whose eyes had gone enormous somewhere between terror and an awe he had no word for. "Son," Levi said, "we're not just going to walk your sister home." He settled his sunglasses down over his eyes. "We're all going to walk her home. And then we're going to have a long, friendly conversation with whoever it is thinks they own that alley about how their lease just ran out. There is no sound on this earth like a motorcycle coming to life. It is not noise. It is a verdict. It is a promise with a throttle." The 4 bikes around Levi roared awake one after another, and the concrete trembled, and Eli felt the sound go straight through the soles of his ruined sneakers and up into his chest where his heart was hammering. Wire pulled a spare helmet off his sissy bar and held it out. Eli looked at it like it was a crown. "You ever ride before, kid?" Wire asked. Eli shook his head. "Then you're about to find out what the cavalry feels like." Levi lifted the boy onto the seat behind him as easily as lifting a coat buckled the helmet under the small chin with fingers that had no right to be so gentle, and put one of Eli's arms around his own broad middle. "Hold tight to me and don't let go," Levi rumbled. "We've got a sister to collect." Eli buried his face in the back of the leather vest, which smelled of gasoline and rain and the long open road. And as the 5 machines pulled out of the gas station and onto Delancey in a single disciplined line, the boy felt something he had not felt in a very long time, not since before his parents died, not since the world had narrowed down to fear and toll alleys and a grandmother's worried face at the window. He felt safe. He felt for the first time in 2 months like he was not the only one standing between his sister and the dark. It was 6 blocks. With the lights running their way, it took them under 3 minutes. And as Levi swung the bike around the corner onto Sycamore, Eli lifted his head and his mouth fell open inside the helmet. The mouth of the alley was already full. The broken arrow had been answered. It was not 5 of bikers. It was not 10. Iron Saints had come from the Brennan chapter and the Steubenville chapter and a knot of independents who rode with them on Sundays, and they had parked their machines in a double rank along the curb that turned the whole block into a wall of chrome and black steel and idling thunder. Pedestrians were crossing to the far sidewalk to get around it. A delivery van had slowed to a crawl, the driver gawking. The air was thick with exhaust and the low, patient growl of a great many engines that had no intention of going anywhere. Later, when people in Brennan told the story, the number would change with the telling. Some said 40, some swore it was nearer 60. The truth, if anyone had counted, was 47, but to an 8-year-old boy on the back of the lead bike, it looked like the whole world had shown up wearing leather. Levi rolled to the head of the line and killed his engine, and the men nearest him cut theirs, and the silence rippled outward, bike by bike, until the only sound left on Sycamore Street was the wind and the far-off hiss of air brakes. The school bus was coming. Levi lifted Eli down and set him on the sidewalk. "Stay right here next to Wire," he said. "Don't move from this spot no matter what. You did the hard part already, son. You asked. Now you watch what asking gets you in this town." The yellow bus hissed to its stop at the corner, and the doors folded open with a clatter, and a thin girl with a long brown ponytail and a backpack clutched against her chest like a shield came down the steps and stopped dead. This was June. She saw the wall of bikers, and she froze her knuckles white on the strap, her eyes darting across the sea of strangers, and every muscle in her small body coiled to run. She had learned this autumn that the world was a place that watched you get hurt and looked at its shoes. She did not yet know there was any other kind. "June," Eli's voice cracked across the street. "June, it's okay, it's okay." Her head snapped toward the sound. She saw her little brother standing on the sidewalk beside a giant in a leather vest, and her fear cracked open into pure, stunned confusion, and she took one hesitant step toward him. And that is when the shadows came to life. From the dog-leg mouth of the alley where the brick narrowed and the light went thin, 4 figures stepped out into the gray afternoon. Teenagers wearing the slouch of men they hadn't earned the right to be yet. The one in front was tall and rangy with a thin, mean face and a smirk that had never once been wiped off it because no one had ever cared enough to do it. He had a half-empty soda cup in one hand. His 3 friends fanned out behind him to seal the alley's mouth, cutting off June's path home, and the lead one's smirk widened when he saw her. "Well, well," said Brett Slater, and his voice carried easy in the dead-still street. "Look who came back, the little snitch." He tilted his head. "You missed your backpack. June want me to put this one on the roof too?" June stopped where she stood, 20 feet from the alley, 30 feet from her brother marooned in the open between them. "I just want to go home," she said, and her voice was so small it nearly disappeared. "Oh, you'll go home," one of the others laughed, "soon as you pay. And the price went up, way up, for you and your snitch grandma both." Brett took a slow, deliberate step toward her and raised the soda cup. "You look thirsty," he said. "Let me help with that." "I wouldn't." The voice was not loud. That was the thing about it. It was a low-level ground floor rumble, calm as bedrock, and it cut through the air on the street like a blade through wet paper. Brett and his 3 friends went rigid. They turned. They were not looking at one biker. They were looking at 47. A silent, unmoving rampart of men in black leather, every one of them looking directly at 4 teenagers in a way that no adult in this neighborhood had looked at them in months. The Iron Saints did not move. They did not shout. They did not reach for anything. They simply watched the way a thunderhead watches a wheat field, and that was somehow worse than any threat could have been. Brett's smirk wobbled. This was not in the script. The script was little kids and lunch money and grandmothers who called a cop that drove away. This was something else entirely. "What the hell is this?" he said, and his voice climbed half an octave on the last word and betrayed him. "This," said Levi Holden, taking one slow step forward off the curb, "is new management." And behind him, all 47 Iron Saints took a single step forward at the same time. The sound of that many boots striking pavement at once was not loud, but it was final, a single deep drum beat that you felt in your sternum, more than heard, and Brett and his three friends took an involuntary step backward into the throat of the alley before they even knew they had done it. Levi crossed the street without hurry. His boots were heavy on the asphalt, unhurried the walk of a man who has never in his life needed to run anywhere, and he stopped 10 feet short of Brett. Up close in the long shadow of him, the teenager who had ruled this alley for 2 months suddenly looked exactly like what he was, a scared kid in a costume. "This is our business, old man." Brett tried scrabbling after the pieces of his pride. "It's just a kid thing. You don't know nothing about it. Get lost." "A kid thing," Levi repeated. He nodded slowly as if considering it. Then he turned his head. "Eli, come here, son." Eli, no longer afraid, darted out from behind wire and ran across the street and pressed himself against Levi's leg, and the big man put one enormous hand on the boy's head, gentle as a blessing. "This boy," Levi said, and his voice dropped lower, colder, every word landing like a stone into still water, "tried to hire me and 46 of my brothers this afternoon. You want to know what he offered to pay us?" He reached down and Eli, understanding, opened his small fist. The crumpled dollar lay damp in the boy's palm. $1, Levi said, his last one, to get his sister past 4 of you. He let that sit in the cold air. He had to spend his last dollar, son, because of you, because of what you decided you'd grown up to be. "We were just messing around," one of the other boys blurted, his voice cracking down the middle. "You're done messing around," said Diesel, stepping up on Levi's left, a barrel of a man with a chain-link tattoo running up his neck. "This path," Levi said, and he gestured behind Brett at the dim dogleg of the alley with one scarred hand, "is closed. The toll's done. Permanent. You and your friends are going to walk out the far end of it right now, and you are never going to stand in it again. You're not going to look at this girl. You're not going to look at her brother. You're not going to think about this block." He took one more step. "Do you understand me?" And Brett, who had been humiliated in front of an army and could not bear it, did the stupidest thing a frightened boy can do. He reached into his jacket. He never finished the motion. Levi's hand moved faster than a man that size had any right to move, faster than Brett's eyes could track, and it closed around the boy's wrist like a steel manacle and held it perfectly still. There was no punch. There was no blow. There was only that grip, and Brett's face going white, and then a small, ugly little folding knife clattering out of his sleeve and onto the concrete between them. Levi did not even look at it. He kept his eyes on Brett's eyes. "That," he said quietly, "is the second worst decision you have made today." He kicked the knife away across the alley without glancing at it. He still had the boy by the wrist, and now he leaned in close and he lowered his voice to a register only Brett could hear. "Here's your choice, son. You can walk out the back of this alley and disappear, and you get to keep the rest of your life. Or you can stay, and you can learn what happens when you put your hands on a child whose family is now my family. You've got about 3 seconds to be smart for the first time this year." He let go and shoved, and Brett stumbled back into his friends, and the 4 of them turned and ran scrambling out the far end of the dog-leg soda cup. Abandoned knife, abandoned dignity, abandoned somewhere on the wet bricks. Not one punch had been thrown. They had been beaten anyway, beaten down to nothing, their 2-month kingdom dissolved in the space of 90 seconds. Levi turned his back on them like they had already ceased to exist. He faced his brothers. "Saints," he said, and it was not a shout, but it carried. "Form the line." In a display of silent discipline that made the watching pedestrians stop dead on the far sidewalk, 47 men turned and arranged themselves into 2 parallel rows that ran from where June stood frozen on the corner all the way to the mouth of the alley, and through it a human corridor of leather and ink, an honor guard for a frightened 11-year-old who had spent the whole autumn learning the world had no honor in it. Levi crouched down to Eli's level one more time. "Go on, son," he said softly. Go get your sister. Walk her home. We'll be right here. Eli stood up straighter than he had stood in months. The fear was gone out of him, replaced by something fierce and bright and proud that swelled his thin chest, and he walked past the towering men who looked down at him with eyes gone unexpectedly soft, and he crossed to where his sister stood weeping with confusion and went up on his toes and took her hand. "It's okay, June," Eli said clear and strong. "I told you I'd fix it. The bad boys are gone." And together the two children walked the alley that had been a gauntlet for 2 months. Only it was no gauntlet at all. It was a passage lined with guardians, 47 leather-clad strangers standing silent watch. And as the kids passed, each man gave them a slow nod, and June, who had not stopped crying, lifted her chin and walked taller. And somewhere in the middle of that corridor, she stopped being a victim and remembered she was a kid who was loved. That was how Hazel Mercer met the Iron Saints. She had heard them coming the way you hear a freight train you can't see a low rumble, that climbed and climbed until the windows in apartment 2C buzzed in their frames and the photographs on the mantle walked themselves a quarter-inch toward the edge. 73 years old, and her first thought had been a riot. Her second thought had been the children, and she was already pulling on her late husband's old barn coat and going down the stairs faster than her hip wanted to carry her, out the front door of Sycamore Court and onto the stoop with her heart in her throat. And there, coming up the cracked walk toward her, were her two grandchildren, alive and whole, and walking out of an army. Hazel Mercer was not a large woman. Age and grief and 40 years of standing on her feet for other people had folded her down to something spare and quick. A sparrow of a woman with white hair pinned back hard and a face full of soft creases and two pale gray eyes that had seen more than their share and refused to be hardened by any of it. She wore her dead husband's coat and her own apron underneath it, and her hands, when she pressed them to her mouth at the sight of June and Eli, were trembling. "Grandma," Eli broke into a run and slammed into her, and she caught him, and June came right behind, and for a moment the three of them stood knotted together on the stoop, while behind them out on the street, 47 engines idled like a held breath. Then Hazel looked up over the heads of her grandchildren, and she saw the giant. Levi had come up the walk behind the kid's hat in his hands now, which surprised even Wire, who had ridden with him 11 years and could count on one hand the times he'd seen the man bare his head for anybody. The president of the Iron Saints stood at the bottom of the stoop steps, and he had taken off his sunglasses, and his weathered, scarred, ruined face was turned up toward the small old woman in the doorway with an expression Hazel could not at first read. "Ma'am," Levi said, and his rumble had gone careful, almost shy. "My name's Levi Holden. I'm president of the Iron Saints. Your grandson, Eli." He stopped and started again. "Your grandson is one of the bravest men I've met in a long while." He walked up to 47 strangers and asked for help with the only dollar he had. "I just wanted to bring him and his sister back to you myself." Hazel's eyes filled. She held her grandchildren, and she looked down at this mountain of a man with his hat crushed in his huge scarred hands, and she said in a voice worn thin but perfectly steady, "I heard the engines. I thought, Lord, I don't know what I thought." "What did you do?" "We had a conversation with the young men in the alley," Levi said simply. "I don't expect they'll be back." "They always come back," Hazel said, and there it was, the thing underneath the exhaustion of a woman who had been let down by everyone in a position to help. "I called the police. A man came and drove past one time and left." "I know, ma'am," Levi said. "That's the difference. We're not the police. We don't drive past." And it was then, as the old woman lifted her chin and looked him full in the face to take the measure of him, that something happened to Levi Holden that he could not have explained to a single living soul. It hit him low and sudden, like missing a step in the dark. Something about her face, something about the way she held her chin up level and unafraid, looking a man twice her size straight in the eye and refusing to flinch. Something about the gray of her eyes and the white hair pinned back hard, and the particular way her mouth set soft and unbreakable at the same time. Something about her stopped the breath in his chest and turned 40 years over inside him in a single instant, like a key trying a lock it doesn't quite fit. And for the space of 3 heartbeats, Levi Holden stood at the bottom of those stoop steps, absolutely certain that he had seen this woman before. He had no idea where, he had no idea when. The harder he reached for it, the further it slid away, the way a name will sit just behind your teeth and refuse to come. But the feeling was real as the cold concrete under his boots, and it left him standing there a half-second too long, with his hat in his hands and his mouth slightly open. "Mr. Holden," Hazel said, and there was a faint furrow of concern in her brow now. "Are you all right?" Levi blinked. He cleared his throat and shook his head once hard like a man coming up out of water. "I'm fine, ma'am," he said. "Forgive me. Long day." But the feeling did not leave him. It sat down in his chest and made itself at home, and it would not be moved. "Well," Hazel said, and she gathered the children closer and drew herself up, and for the first time something, almost like a smile, touched the corner of her mouth, fragile and real. "Mr. Holden, you brought my babies home. The least I can do is put a pot of coffee on. I won't take no for an answer, and at my age I've gotten very good at not taking it." She paused, and her gray eyes went over the wall of motorcycles and leather behind him, 47 hard men idling in the autumn light. And the corner of her mouth lifted a fraction more. "Though I'll confess I don't believe I've got cups enough for the whole congregation." Levi laughed a short, surprised bark of a sound that he hadn't expected to make, and he turned and told the brothers to head on back to the clubhouse, all but Wire, who he kept beside him, and the great wall of engines came alive once more and peeled away down Sycamore in a rolling thunder that set off 3 car alarms and brought a dozen faces to a dozen windows, and then the street was quiet. And Levi Holden climbed the stoop of Sycamore Court behind a 73-year-old woman and her 2 grandchildren, ducking his head under the low doorframe into the rest of his life. Apartment 2C was small and worn and clean to the point of fierceness. Every surface that could be polished had been polished. The furniture was older than the children and mended in places with a careful, invisible hand. There was a smell of coffee and dish soap and faintly of the cinnamon Hazel kept in a jar, because the children liked it on their toast, and there were photographs everywhere on the mantel, on the side table marching up the wall beside the stairs. The visual record of a long life lived close to the bone and rich in everything that didn't cost money. Levi did not fit in the room. He knew it, and the room knew it. He folded himself down onto a couch that groaned under him and accepted a mug of coffee in a hand that made it look like a thimble, and he watched the old woman move around her kitchen with the economical grace of someone who had spent 50 years feeding people, and the children sat close on either side of him, as if they had decided he belonged to them now. "You'll have to forgive the place," Hazel said over her shoulder. "It was bigger when their parents were here. Felt smaller, but it was bigger." She set out a plate of store cookies on the coffee table with the ceremony of a woman serving a king. "I never thought I'd be raising children at my age, Lord knows. But you don't ask the Lord for the size of the load, Mr. Holden. You just ask him for the back." "What happened to them?" Levi asked quietly. "The parents, if you don't mind my asking." Hazel's hands went still on the counter for a moment. Then she came and sat in the worn chair across from him, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she told him. Her son Tom and his wife had died 14 months ago. A car accident late at night out on the county road past the old foundry, the road slick with the first ice of the year. Tom had been driving home from the second of his 2 jobs. The police had called it an accident. There had been no other car, they said, no witnesses. The car had simply gone off the road on a curve Tom had driven 10,000 times, gone down the embankment and into the creek, and that had been that. Hazel had buried her only son and his wife in the same week, and she had taken in June and Eli, and she had not stopped moving since, because if she stopped moving, the grief would catch up to her and she could not afford to be caught. "He knew that road in his sleep," she said, and for the first time her voice wavered just slightly. "My Tom, he drove it every night of his life. I don't—" She stopped herself. She straightened her spine. "Well, it doesn't matter what an old woman thinks. The police said accident, so accident it was." Levi heard the thing she would not say. He filed it away without a word. "You said it was bigger when they were here," he said instead. "The apartment. This whole building was different," Hazel said, and now something came into her face, a complicated thing, pride and worry braided together. "Sycamore Court, my Roy and I, my late husband, we lived in this building 41 years. Roy was the super here, fixed every pipe and every furnace in the place with his own 2 hands. He loved it, loved the people in it. When old Mr. Calder, who owned it, passed, he left Roy." She stopped, and her eyes went to a wooden box on the top shelf of the bookcase. A plain pine box with a brass clasp, and then came back to Levi, and she seemed to decide something, and she did not finish the sentence. It's a long story, and an old woman's stories run too long. The point is, this building has been my whole life, Mr. Holden. And lately, the worry won out over the pride. Lately, there are people who would very much like to take it away from all of us. What people? Levi said. But before Hazel could answer, the front door opened, and a young woman came in with a grocery bag on her hip and a key still in her hand, and stopped dead at the sight of the enormous biker on the couch. This was Rachel from 1B. Hazel explained, a single mother 2 floors down, and behind Rachel in the hall, there were already other faces drawn by the unbelievable rumor that had run through the building in the last 20 minutes. The bikers came, the bikers ran off of the alley boys, the bikers brought the Mercer kids home. By the time Hazel had refilled the coffee pot twice, there were 9 grown people crowded into apartment 2C and the hallway outside it. Neighbors who had not all been in the same room together in years, and slowly, haltingly, the whole shape of the thing came out, and it was bigger and uglier than one alley and 4 teenagers. It had started in the spring. A company nobody had heard of with a name made of initials had bought the mortgage on Sycamore Court and 3 other buildings on the east side. Soon after the new owners had stopped fixing things, the boiler that Roy had nursed along for 40 years had finally died in July, and nobody had come to fix it, and the families had spent the worst of the summer with no hot water. Then the rent notices had come, raises that no one on the east side could pay. Then the inspections had started, city inspectors finding violations no one had ever heard of, citing the building for the very repairs the new owners refused to make. Then the eviction notices one by one slid under doors. 2 families had already left. The Okafors in 3A had taken a settlement and gone. The whole building had the feeling now of a ship taking on water, everyone bailing, no one able to find the leak. And then just lately there were the boys in the alley. "That's the part that don't make sense," said a heavy-set man named Whitlock from 2A, turning his cap in his hands. "Those boys been around the neighborhood forever. Little punks, sure, but small time. Lunch money. Then about 2 months back, sudden like they get organized. They start working that alley like it's a job. Like somebody's paying them to make folks miserable. And it's always our building they're after. Always the court kids." The room went quiet at that. Levi felt the back of his neck prickle, the old instinct that had kept him alive through 2 decades of a life that should have killed him several times over. "Say that again," and he said. Whitlock blinked. "Which part?" "The part where it changed 2 months ago. The part where it's always your building." Levi set his coffee down on the table very carefully. "Mr. Whitlock, you think somebody's paying those boys to terrorize this block?" The man shrugged, uncomfortable. "Think it's as funny how the bullying got bad right when the eviction notices started. I think it's funny how it's the families who won't sell, won't take the settlement, won't leave. It's their kids who get it worst in that alley. The Okafors, before they left, their boy got beat so bad he didn't come out of the apartment for a week. Then they signed the papers, and wouldn't you know, those alley boys never touched another Okafor." He spread his hands. "Maybe it's nothing. Maybe an old man sees patterns that ain't there, but you asked." It was not nothing. Levi knew the texture of it the way he knew the smell of a coming storm. He had run with men once in his younger, darker years who used exactly this kind of pressure. The slow squeeze that never quite became a crime. You could point at the made-up inspections and the broken boilers and the frightened children, all of it grinding a building down until the people in it gave up and walked away and left the land for someone to scrape clean and sell. It was extortion with a business plan. And the boys in the alley were not the disease. They were a symptom. Somebody upstream wanted Sycamore Court emptied, and somebody upstream had decided the fastest way to do it was to make sure the children of the families who wouldn't leave came home crying every single day. Levi looked across the crowded little room at Hazel Mercer, at the white hair pinned back hard, and the soft creased face, and the gray eyes that had buried a husband and a son, and were now squared up to lose her home, and the strange, unplaceable feeling moved through him again. That certainty that he had known this woman somewhere in another life, and underneath it now a colder feeling settled into his bones. The recognition of a fight that was about to become a great deal larger than one alley. "Ma'am," he said, "you started to tell me. The people who want this building. You know who they are." Hazel rose. She crossed to the bookcase and she reached up with both hands and she brought down the plain pine box with the brass clasp, and she set it on the coffee table in front of the enormous stranger as if she were laying down a weapon. For a long moment, she stood looking at it, her hands resting on the lid. My Roy used to say a man's whole worth fits in a small box if he lived right, she said quietly. This is Roy's box. There are things in here I haven't shown another living soul since he died. But I think she looked at Levi and then at her grandchildren, June with her ponytail and her brave wet eyes, and Eli still pressed warm against the biker's enormous side, and something in her seemed to make its decision all at once and for good. I think the time for keeping secrets in boxes might be over. She opened the clasp, and Levi Holden leaned forward, and the children leaned forward, and the whole crowded room held its breath. And for the second time that afternoon, the path that had chosen Levi turned a corner he could not see around. Because the first thing on top, the first thing Hazel lifted out of her dead husband's box with her trembling, careful hands, was not a deed or a will or a letter. It was a photograph, old and curled at the edges, of a young woman in a waitress uniform, standing in front of a roadside diner under a sign that read, Grace's. And the young woman was laughing at the camera with her chin tipped up, level and unafraid, white teeth and gray eyes and dark hair pinned back hard off her face. Levi Holden looked at the photograph and the breath went out of him as if he had been struck. Because he had eaten at that diner once, 40 years ago, on the worst night of his life. And he had never in all the years since forgotten the face of the young waitress who had looked at him without flinching when every other soul on earth was afraid. Levi did not say anything. That was the hardest thing he had ever done in a room, and he had been in some rooms. He looked at the photograph of the young waitress under the Grace's sign, and 40 years fell on him all at once, and he kept his face still as stone while inside him something shook so hard he was amazed the coffee in his hand did not spill. He was not a man given to ghosts, but he was looking at one now, and he was not yet sure enough of what he was seeing to put words to it. And a lifetime of hard caution told him to be sure before he spoke. A man does not lay a thing like that at an old woman's feet until he knows for certain it is true. So he only said, "Pretty girl." "That's me," Hazel said, and she smiled at the photo with a sadness that had worn soft and smooth as a river stone. 1981. I waited tables at a place out on Route 9 before Roy and I married. Grace's. It's gone now, like everything's gone now. She set the photograph aside on the table face up, and Levi could not stop his eyes from going back to it. But that's not what I meant to show you. And she reached back into the box. What came out next changed the whole shape of the fight. It was an envelope yellowed with age, and inside the envelope was a document on heavy paper with a notary's seal pressed into the corner, and Hazel laid it flat on the table and smoothed it with both hands and let Levi read it for himself. It was old Mr. Calder's last will and testament, and it was very short, and the part that mattered was a single paragraph. Calder, who had owned Sycamore Court and who had no children of his own, had left a 49% ownership stake in the building, in perpetuity and in trust to his superintendent and friend Roy Mercer, and his heirs in gratitude for 40 years of faithful keeping, and to ensure the families of this house are never put out of it by men who see only the land. Roy never told a soul, Hazel said softly. He was a proud man, but a quiet one. He didn't want the neighbors treating him different, thinking he was their landlord. So he kept the keeping and let the lawyers keep the paper, and the other 51% stayed with the old Calder's estate, and the estate sold it on building got sold, and sold again over the years, and nobody ever knew Roy held the half he held. Then Roy passed. Then last year my Tom passed, and the paper came down to me, and to those two children. She touched June's hair and Eli's shoulder. 49% of Sycamore Court belongs to my grandbaby's Mr. Holden. The men trying to empty this building so they can knock it down, they own the other 51. But they cannot do a single thing to this property without our say, not legally, not while this paper stands. The room had gone utterly silent. Whitlock had stopped turning his cap. And they know that, Levi said slowly, understanding flooding in. That's why the squeeze. They can't buy you out clean and they can't push you out legal, so they're trying to make you scared enough and tired enough and worried enough about those kids that you sell them your half for pennies just to make it stop. Yes, Hazel said. Mr. Holden, I have been offered $11,000 for a half share in a building worth a great deal more than that by a man who tells me very politely that the neighborhood is dangerous for children, and a woman my age would be safe to take what she can get while she can get it. Her gray eyes came up level and unafraid exactly as they were in the photograph 40 years gone. I told him no. I have told him no every single week since the spring. And every week since the spring, it has gotten a little worse around here. The boiler, the inspections, the notices, and now my granddaughter's backpack on a roof and my grandson spending his last dollar to buy her safe passage home. Her voice did not break, but it went very low and very hard. I am 73 years old. I have buried my husband and my only son. I have nothing left in this world but those two children and the home Roy gave his whole life to keep. And I will burn before I sell it to the man who is doing this. I just don't know how to fight him. I'm one old woman. No, ma'am, Levi said, and he stood up off the couch to his full towering height, and he looked down at the small, fierce woman and her grandchildren and the crowded room of frightened neighbors, and the unplaceable feeling and the cold certainty had braided themselves together in his chest into something that felt for the first time in a long time like purpose. You're not one old woman. As of about 3 o'clock this afternoon, you're one old woman and 47 iron saints. What's his name? Hazel told him. The man who came every week with the $11,000 smile and the warnings about the dangerous neighborhood. The man whose initials were on the shell company that owned 51% of Sycamore Court and the mortgages on 3 other East Side buildings besides. Marshall Decker, she said. Levi Holden had never heard the name in his life, but he would come to know it the way a man comes to know a scar. That night in the back room of the Iron Saints clubhouse under the buzzing fluorescent lights and the wall of photographs of brothers living and dead, Levi laid it out for the men who mattered. Wire was there, and Diesel and Book with his reading glasses and his quiet menace, and Tully and a half dozen others who had been saints long enough to be trusted with the kind of work that did not get talked about outside that room. He told them about the boy and the dollar. He told them about the alley. He told them about the building and the will and the 49% and the man named Marshall Decker who paid teenagers to make children cry so an old woman would sell him her dead husband's life. He did not tell them about the photograph. That was his for now until he was sure. So what are we? Tully said when Levi was done. We muscle. We go put Decker's head through his own desk and tell him to leave the old lady alone. No, Levi said. That's exactly what he'd want. Man like this, he's not a fistfight. He's a businessman. He's got lawyers and inspectors and money and the patience of a spider. We put our hands on him. We're the dangerous element he keeps telling everybody we are. We hand him the headline and the lawsuit, and he uses it to drive the rest of those families out, says, see, I told you the bikers, the danger, and the old woman's left holding nothing. No. He leaned over the scarred table. We don't fight him like bikers. We fight him like he fights. We dig. We find out exactly who he's paying and what he's hiding, and we make it so the whole thing comes apart in the daylight where everybody can see it. We make Marshall Decker the monster instead of the men he's been pointing at. A slow, grim smile moved through the gray of his beard. And in the meantime, every single afternoon at 3:25, there are going to be 2 saints parked at each end of that alley. And there is not going to be one more frightened child on Sycamore Street. Not one. Are we agreed? They were agreed. That was the thing people never understood about men like the Iron Saints, the thing the leather hid too well. When the cause was right, there was no faster yes on earth. So the digging began. Book, it turned out, had a nephew who worked in the county recorder's office, and the nephew, for the price of a tank of coin and a clear conscience, pulled the whole filthy chain of paper on Sycamore Court and laid it out across 2 folding tables in the clubhouse. The shell company that owned the 51% had a name like a license plate, a string of letters that meant nothing, but the registered agent traced to a law office downtown, and the law office traced. After 3 more layers of nesting, companies built precisely so that no honest person would ever bother to unstack them, to a single name at the bottom of all of it. Marshall Decker, a developer, a man with a glass office on the top floor of the only tall building in Brennan, a man who had spent 15 years buying up the cheap, dying East Side block by block and waiting the ways a patient man waits. For the day, the city's promised riverfront redevelopment money came through and turned the worthless land under all those poor people's homes into the most valuable acreage in 3 counties. Sycamore Court sat dead center in the footprint Decker had been assembling. And Sycamore Court was the one building he could not have because of 49% held in trust by a dead super's widow and 2 orphaned children, and a will with a notary's seal that said in plain English that men who saw only the land could go to hell. Diesel found the inspector. It wasn't hard once they knew to look. The same city building inspector had signed every one of the bogus violation notices on Sycamore Court, and on Decker's other East Side buildings, a man named Pruitt, who drove a truck that cost more than a building inspector made in a year and a half, and who had it developed a serious and expensive fondness for the card rooms 2 counties over. Book's nephew found the violations Pruitt had quietly waived on Decker's own properties, even as he cited Sycamore Court for the identical conditions. It was all there if you knew to stack it up. A bought inspector, a manufactured crisis, a long, patient squeeze. But the thing that turned Levi's stomach, the thing he sat with alone in the dark of the clubhouse late that night after the others had gone, was the alley. Because they found out who was paying the boys too. It was Wire who got it in the end, and the way he got it was the ugliest part of the whole ugly business. Wire had a daughter the same age as the Slater boy, and he knew the family a little from before, and he went and sat with Brett Slater's mother in her kitchen for 2 hours one evening, and he came back to the clubhouse with his jaw set hard and a look in his eye Levi had not seen on him in years. "It's not what we thought," Wire said. "Not exactly. The kid Brett, he's not just some punk doing it for kicks." He pulled out a chair and sat down heavy. "His mother's sick. Levi. Real sick. Kidney thing needs a machine 3 times a week, can't work no more." They were about to lose their place last spring, and then a man comes around, real friendly, says he's got a job for Brett. Says all the boys got to do is hang around a certain alley after school and make sure a certain building's families know the neighborhood's gone bad for kids. Cash money every week, enough to keep the lights on and the mother's treatments going. Wire's voice was flat and disgusted. Decker's the one paying him. The kid hates it. His mother's ashamed of it. But it's that or the street, and they got nowhere to go, and Decker knows it, and that's exactly why he picked them. He didn't hire a gang. He bought a desperate family and made the boy do his dirty work so that if it ever came apart, it'd be a sick woman's son who took the fall and not him. Levi sat with that a long time. He had ridden into this thing seeing 4 punks in an alley and 1 cartoon villain in a glass tower. And the truth, as the truth always was worse and sadder and more human than that. Marshall Decker did not just terrorize children. He manufactured the people who terrorized them, took the most desperate family on the block, and turned a frightened, sick woman's boy into the instrument of his cruelty so that the cruelty had a face that wasn't his. There was a particular evil in it that Levi recognized because he had once in his worst years been the kind of disposable, desperate boy that powerful men used and threw away. He knew exactly how it felt to be the fist somebody else swung. He thought about the photograph in the pine box. He thought about the worst night of his own life 40 years ago, and the young waitress under the Grace's sign who had looked at exactly that kind of disposable, desperate, dangerous boy and had refused to be afraid of him and had changed everything. And Levi Holden began very quietly in the dark of the empty clubhouse to form a plan. The next morning at 3:25, 2 Iron Saints were parked at each mouth of the alley behind the Edsel laundromat engines, idling low, and they were there the next day and the day after that. They did not have to do anything. That was the beauty of it. They simply existed there, vast and patient and impossible to ignore. And the children of Sycamore Court walked home through a space that had been a place of fear, and nobody touched them, and nobody could, and slowly. The way a held breath finally lets go, the block began to remember what safety felt like. On the 3rd day, Whitlock from 2A came down with a thermos and poured coffee for the 2 men at the south end. On the 4th day, 3 more neighbors came out. On the 5th day, Wano from 1B brought a folding table and a plate of muffins and set it up on the corner, and other people brought chairs, and by the 2nd week, the alley that had been a gauntlet had become, of all the impossible things, the social heart of the street. A little gathering every afternoon where parents drank coffee and watched their children come home and remembered each other's names. The Iron Saints had not just cleared the alley. They had given the neighborhood back its courage, and courage, once it remembers itself, is very hard to take away again. And Levi Holden found reasons to be at Sycamore Court. He told himself it was the case. He told himself he needed to go over the paperwork, with Hazel needed to understand the will, needed to coordinate the alley watch. And some of that was even true. But the truth underneath the truth was that Levi could not stay away from the small, fierce woman in apartment 2C, and he could not stop looking for the young waitress in her face. And the more time he spent in her quiet company, the more sure he became that he was right. And the more terrified he became of being right, because being right meant a debt 40 years old had finally come due, and Levi Holden did not know if he had it in him to pay it. He learned things about her slow in the way of two old people who have both lost too much to waste words. He learned that she had married Roy Mercer in 1982, the year after the Grace's photograph, and that Roy had been a good man with quiet hands and a stubborn faith, and that the two of them had never had much money but had somehow always had enough. He learned that she had worked as a cook at a school cafeteria for 26 years and had fed half the grown men in Brennan when they were boys. He learned that she still set Roy's coffee mug out some mornings out of habit before she remembered and then put it away. He learned that she sang very low when she did the dishes, hymns mostly the same ones over and over, and that one of them was the one she'd been singing under her breath in the Grace's diner 40 years ago on the worst night of Levi Holden's life, though she did not know that and he did not tell her. And Eli the boy attached himself to Levi the way a small ship attaches to a great one in a storm. He waited at the window for the bike. He learned the names of all the saints and the names of all the bikes. He asked Levi 100 questions a day about the road and the brothers and the scars, and Levi, who had never had children of his own and had assumed that door closed forever, found himself answering every one and looking forward to the asking. It could not last, of course. Men like Decker do not lose a building to coffee and muffins. The squeeze tightened. It came first as a letter hand-delivered by a man in a suit, and it was very polite, and it informed the residents of Sycamore Court that the building had been cited for a long list of critical, structural, and safety violations, and that the city's building department had scheduled a condemnation hearing, and that the building might be declared unfit for human habitation, in which case all residents would be required to vacate within 30 days, regardless of their leases. The same Inspector Pruitt's name was on the bottom. It was Levi knew the instant he read it the endgame. Decker had decided he was done waiting for Hazel to break. He was going to use the bought inspector and the bought paperwork to have the city itself throw everyone out, will or no will, and once the building stood empty and condemned the 49% Hazel held would be worth nothing, and Decker would buy it for $1 and bulldoze the whole block. And then it came worse. Levi went to see Marshall Decker. He went alone in a clean shirt with no patch on it, and he sat in the glass tower's marble lobby until they let him up, and Decker, who was younger than Levi expected, and softer, a smooth, round-faced man of 50, with very white teeth and very still eyes, met him in an office with a view of the whole dying city, and was perfectly, dangerously pleasant. "Mr. Holden," Decker said, not getting up, not offering his hand. "I know who you are. I make it my business to know who's standing on my land. Let me save us both some time. The Mercer woman is going to lose that building. Not because I'm cruel, I'm not cruel, whatever the neighborhood says, but because the math is the math, and the math doesn't care about anybody's dead husband." He smiled his white smile. "What I can do is make it gentle. A nice settlement. Enough for her to move somewhere safer with those grandchildren. Somewhere those children won't keep getting hurt in alleys. You've seen how dangerous it's gotten over there. Terrible thing what happens to kids in a neighborhood like that." The smile did not move, but the still eyes came up and held Levi's, and there was a message in them, plain as print. "I am the one making it dangerous. I will make it as dangerous as I need to, and there is nothing you can do, because I never touch anyone myself. You seem like a sensible man. Help her see sense. It would be a shame if something happened and that made the whole thing harder for everybody." Levi said almost nothing. He had not come to fight. He had come to look the man in the eye and take his measure the way he'd taken Brett's measure in the alley, and what he saw was worse than Brett by an order of magnitude, because Brett was a frightened boy doing an evil thing, and Marshall Decker was a comfortable man who had decided long ago that other people's suffering was simply a line item. "I hear you," was all Levi said, and he stood up and he went out, and behind him Marshall Decker smiled at the city he intended to own. But Levi had seen one thing in that office that Decker had not meant him to see. On the wall among the framed renderings of the glassy riverfront that Decker dreamed of building on the bones of the east side, there had been a framed news clipping. A local paper photo of Decker shaking hands with the mayor at the announcement of the redevelopment money, and dated in the corner, and the date had been 14 months ago. 2 weeks before Tom Mercer drove off a road he knew in his sleep and into a creek with no other car and no witnesses. Levi did not believe in coincidence. He had survived too long by not believing in it. He went back to Book's nephew at the recorder's office, and he had Wire lean gently on a man who'd worked at the foundry near where Tom died, and what came back over the next 10 days assembled itself into a shape that made Levi's blood run cold and quiet at the same time. Tom Mercer had found the will. That was the thing. 14 months ago, going through his late father Roy's papers, Tom had found old Calder's will and understood for the first time that his family owned 49% of a building that sat dead center in the footprint of the richest redevelopment deal the county had ever seen. And Tom Mercer, a man with 2 jobs and a young family, had gone to a lawyer about it. And the lawyer he had gone to, by the bad luck that runs the world, was a lawyer who also did work for Marshall Decker. 3 days after Tom Mercer sat in that lawyer's office and asked what his family's 49% was really worth, somebody made a phone call. And 2 weeks after that, Tom Mercer's car went off a road he had driven 10,000 times on a clear, cold night with no other vehicle involved and no witness to say otherwise. There was no proof. There would never be proof. Men like Decker did not leave proof, they paid for the absence of it. But Levi Holden sat alone in the clubhouse at 2 in the morning with the pieces laid out in front of him, and understood with the certainty of a man who had once lived in that world that Hazel Mercer had not lost her son to ice on a curve. She had lost him to 49% of a building, and she did not know it. And the man who had done it came to her door every week with an $11,000 smile and warned her about the dangerous neighborhood. He did not tell her. Not yet. He did not have it in him to put that on a woman who was already carrying the world, not without proof, not until he could give her justice along with the grief. But it changed him, that knowledge. It took the thing that had been a fight about a building and made it something a great deal older and harder, and it settled the last of his hesitation. The debt was real now in 2 directions. The 40-year debt he could not yet name, and this new debt of blood that cried out from a creek bed on the county road, and Levi Holden was going to pay both if it was the last thing the road ever asked of him. In the weeks before that, though, Decker tried the thing that came before the fire, the thing men like him always try first because it is cheaper than arson and leaves no ash. He tried to break the old woman directly. It started small, the way these things always start small, so that a frightened person cannot quite point to anything and say, that is a crime. A car began to sit at the end of Sycamore Street. In the afternoons, a plain, dark sedan, with a man in it who did nothing but sit and watch and write things in a small notebook whenever a child came up the block. Hazel saw it from her window. She told herself it was nothing. Then the car was there the next day and the day after. And on the 3rd day, when June got off the bus, the car pulled out slow and rolled along beside her down the whole length of the block at walking pace close to the curb, the man inside looking straight at her and saying nothing. And June came through the door of apartment 2C, white and shaking, and would not let go of her grandmother's apron for an hour. That was the message. It was a message with no fingerprints on it. A man can sit in a car. A man can drive slowly. There is no law against looking at a child, and Decker knew there was no law against it, and that was precisely why he had chosen it, the same way he had chosen a sick woman's son for the alley, the same patient cruelty that always stayed exactly 1 inch on the safe side of the line. He was telling Hazel Mercer without a word that any court could ever touch, that he could reach her grandchildren anytime he liked, and that the fire escapes and the police and even the bikers could not be everywhere at once, and that all of this would simply continue slow and grinding and impossible to prove until the day she finally signed. Hazel did not call the police. She had learned what the police were worth on this street. She called Levi. He came within the hour, and he sat at her small kitchen table with his hat in his hands and listened while she told it in a flat, steady voice that did not shake until the very end, when she got to the part about the car rolling alongside June And then her voice did shake just once, and she put her hand over her mouth and mastered it. I have been afraid my whole life and never let it move me, Hazel said. Afraid for Roy, afraid for Tom, afraid the rent wouldn't make. I have looked all of it dead in the eye and never once let it run me. Her gray eyes came up, and for the first time since Levi had met her, there was something close to defeat in them, and it was worse than any tears. But I cannot look at a man rolling a car next to my granddaughter. I can't, Levi. He's found the one thing. He's found the one thing I can't stare down. Levi reached across the table and put one of his huge, scarred hands over both of her small ones, and he held them the way she had once held the hands of a murderer in a diner booth, though neither of them yet knew that was what was happening, and he said, "Then you don't stare it down alone. That's the whole point of what happened to you in that gas station 3 weeks ago, Hazel. You stopped being alone." He paused. "Tomorrow when that bus comes, June isn't going to walk home past an empty street with one car in it. She's going to walk home past me, and the day after that, and every day after that for as long as it takes until the man in the car understands that the street he's been watching is being watched right back." And that is what happened. The next afternoon, Levi Holden parked his bike at the bus stop and stood beside it, arms folded a mountain in leather. And when June came down the steps, he walked her the whole length of Sycamore Street to her own door, and the dark sedan at the end of the block did not move, and the man inside it did not write anything in his little notebook. And the day after that, the sedan was gone, and it did not come back. It was not a victory. Levi knew it was not a victory. It only meant Decker had crossed off the cheap option and moved on to the next one on his list, and the next one on his list was always going to be worse. But it bought June her walk home unafraid, and Levi had learned a long time ago that you do not refuse a child a single afternoon of being unafraid just because the larger war is not yet won. You give them the afternoon. You give them every afternoon you can. The afternoons are not nothing. The afternoons strung together are most of what a childhood even is. Those weeks taught Levi the rest of Hazel Mercer, the parts that did not fit in a photograph or a will. He learned that she rose at 5 every morning out of 50 years of habit and could not break it, and that she used the quiet hour to read her Bible at the kitchen table with a single lamp on the same worn book Roy had given her the year they married. He learned that she worried out loud about money in front of him in a way she would never have done in front of the neighbors, because somewhere in the 3 weeks she had decided that Levi did not count as company, that he was past the line into the place where you do not perform, and that quiet promotion meant more to the big scarred man than any thanks she could have spoken. He learned that she was funny, dry, and quick under all that grief, that she could land a small, sharp joke and watch it go off across the table with a glint in her eye that took 30 years off her. And he learned watching her with June and Eli, that the fierceness people saw in her was not fierceness at all, but love wearing armor, the armor a person puts on when they have learned the hard way that love is the thing the world keeps trying to take, and that you had better stand in front of it, chin up, if you mean to keep it. He loved her. He could admit that to himself now in the plain, unromantic way. An old man loves the proof that his life had not been wasted, loves the person who turns out to have been the hinge his whole existence swung on. He had carried a debt for 40 years, and the debt had a face now, and the face was at the head of a small table in a worn, clean apartment that smelled of coffee and cinnamon, and Levi Holden, who had spent 2 decades being feared, discovered that he would rather be useful to this one old woman than feared by every soul in 3 counties, and that the discovery did not diminish him in the slightest. A man can be a mountain and a shelter at the same time. The shelter is what the mountain is for. And then on a cold Thursday in November, Marshall Decker's patience ran all the way out, and he did the thing that finally crossed the line he had always stayed so carefully behind. It was Brett Slater who came to warn them, which nobody could have predicted, and the fact that it was Brett was the proof of how badly the whole thing had twisted the boy. He came to the clubhouse at dusk, white-faced and shaking, and he stood in the doorway where weeks before he had been the terror of an alley, and now looked like exactly what he was, a frightened 17-year-old in over his head, and he said the words in a rush before his courage could fail. "He's gonna burn it," Brett said. "Decker, he gave up waiting. The condemnation thing's taken too long. So there's a guy I heard him on the phone with, the guy he's paying a guy to torch the court tonight, make it look like bad wiring, so it'll be condemned for real and everybody's got to get out and the old lady can't fight it no more. His voice cracked. I'm done, mister. I'm done with him. He made me, he made my mom. I can't do it no more. He's going to burn that whole building down with people in it, and I can't. The boy's legs nearly went out from under him. There's families in there. There's little kids in there. He doesn't care. Tonight. He's doing it tonight. Levi was already on his feet, already moving, already roaring the broken arrow into his phone for the second time in a month, and this time his voice was not calm at all, because Hazel Mercer and June and Eli were in that building. And the worst night of Levi Holden's life, the one he had carried for 40 years, was about to find a rival. There is a kind of cold that has nothing to do with the weather, and Levi Holden rode through it that night faster than he had ridden in 20 years, the city smearing past him in streaks of sodium light, Brett Slater clinging to Wire's bike beside him, and the rest of the Saints strung out behind in a roar that woke the whole east side. He had called the fire department before he ever swung a leg over the bike. He did not trust it to be enough. Men like Decker bought patience, and patience meant the fire would be set to look like an accident, which meant it would be set somewhere it could grow before anyone smelled smoke. The basement, most likely near the dead boiler, the wiring everyone already knew was bad. By the time a smoke alarm woke a sleeping family on the third floor, it could already be too late. He was right about the basement. He was wrong about the time. They came around the corner onto Sycamore, and there was no fire, yet no flames in the windows, and for one cracking instant, Levi let himself believe they had beaten it. Then he saw the figure slipping up out of the basement stairwell at the side of the building, a man with a gas can moving fast and low, and he saw the faint flicker already starting to grow behind the small ground floor windows, orange light blooming in the dark where no light should be. And he understood that the fire was already lit and the families above it were asleep. What happened next happened in pieces the way the worst nights always do, too fast to hold and too slow to bear. Levi laid his bike down at the curb and was off it before it stopped sliding, running for the front door of the building, bellowing in a voice that rattled glass for everyone to get out, fire, and behind him, the Saints scattered to every door and every window, hammering, shouting, dragging the neighborhood up out of sleep. Diesel and two others went after the man with the gas can, who dropped it and ran and made it exactly 40 feet before 300 and some pounds of furious biker took him down, into the frozen pavement and held him there. Wire went up the fire escape on the east side, banging on windows. Book and Tully went in the front and up the main stairs into the thickening smoke, kicking doors, getting people out. And Levi went up to the second floor to apartment 2C because that was the only door in the world that mattered to him. The smoke was already in the stairwell, low and gray, and getting blacker, and the heat was rising up through the floor from the basement fire that was eating the old dry guts of the building faster than anyone had a right to expect. Levi hit the door of 2C with his shoulder, and it gave, and he came through into the smoke, calling her name, and he found Hazel Mercer in the hall in her nightgown, with Eli's hand in hers and her face calm and terrible. And she said the only thing that could have made his heart stop. June's not here. Her voice did not shake. That was the worst of it, the steadiness of her, the calm of a woman who had learned that fear was a luxury she could not afford. She went up to the third floor before bed to sit with Rachel's little ones while Rachel worked the late shift. She's up there, Levi. She's up there with two babies and the fires underneath them. Levi did not waste a second on words. He took Eli and put him into Wire's hands at the top of the stairs, and he told Hazel to go down now, and she would not. Of course, she would not, and there was no time to make her, so he left her at the second floor landing with Book to get her out, and he went up alone into the third floor, where the smoke was a solid black thing now and the heat pressed down like a hand. He found them in Rachel's apartment in the back bedroom because June had done everything right. 11 years old, and she had remembered what they teach. You had gotten the two little ones down low and put a wet towel under the door and was holding them by the window in the one corner where the air was still good, and she was singing to them, the babies singing low and steady to keep them from panicking, the same hymn her grandmother sang over the dishes. And the sound of that child's small voice singing in the smoke went into Levi Holden and lodged there and never left him for the rest of his days. June, he said, and she turned, and her face when she saw him was not relief. It was something better than relief. It was the absolute total trust of a child who had decided weeks ago in an alley that this man kept his promises. "I knew you'd come," she said. He carried all three of them out. He could never afterward have explained how a 61-year-old man with bad knees and 40 years of hard miles, two toddlers in one arm, and an 11-year-old over his shoulder, down through a stairwell full of black smoke and rising heat. But he did it because there are things a man does that have nothing to do with what his body should be able to do. And he came out the front door of Sycamore Court into the freezing night and the flashing lights of the fire trucks that had finally arrived. And he went down on his knees on the frozen grass, and the children came off him into a dozen reaching hands. And somewhere in the crowd, Hazel Mercer made a sound he had never heard a human being make before, half a sob and half a prayer, as her granddaughter was put into her arms alive. The fire department got the rest of it. The basement blaze had been set to grow slow and look like wiring, and the Saints' early warning had bought just enough minutes, and the building was hurt, but it was not lost. Smoke and water damage on the lower floors, the basement gutted, but standing, still standing. Every single resident got out. Not one soul was lost. It would be remembered on the east side for a generation. The night the bikers pulled the whole building out of the smoke. The night bears heirs, though Levi was not bare. That was the original tale. This was the new one. But the legend ran the same channels. The night the Iron Saints carried Sycamore Court out of the fire on their backs, and the man with the gas can, the one Diesel had taken down on the frozen pavement, was still very much there when the police arrived, zip-tied and furious and frightened. And he had a phone in his pocket, and the phone had a call log on it, and the call log told its own story to anyone who cared to read it, which the Iron Saints made very sure the police this time were going to care to do. Brett Slater stood across the street through all of it, white and shaking, watching the building he had been paid to help destroy be saved by the men he had once terrorized children in front of. And when it was over, Levi found him there, and the boy could not meet his eyes. "I helped him," Brett said, barely audible. "For 2 months I helped him. The alley, scaring those kids. It was all for him, all so he could—" His voice broke completely. "Those babies were up there. June was up there. If I hadn't come and told you—" He could not finish. Levi looked at the boy a long moment. He thought about a disposable, desperate kid 40 years ago, and a young waitress who had refused to be afraid of him. "You did come and tell us," Levi said. "Remember that part too. A man's not just the worst thing he ever did, son. He's also the hardest right thing he ever managed when it cost him everything. You walked into a clubhouse full of men who had every reason to break you in half, and you told the truth, and you saved 3 children's lives doing it." He put one enormous, scarred hand on the boy's shoulder, the same hand he'd put on Eli's head in the alley. "That counts. That counts for a lot. Now I need you to do one more hard right thing. I need you to tell the police every single word you heard Decker say. Can you do that?" Brett Slater looked up at him, and something steadied in the boy's wet eyes. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I can do that." It was nearly dawn before the trucks left, and the street emptied, and the smoke stink settled into the cold. Hazel Mercer sat on the curb wrapped in a blanket somebody had given her, with June asleep against one side and Eli asleep against the other. And Levi Holden sat down beside her on the cold concrete because his knees would not hold him standing any longer. And for a long while, neither of them said anything. The sky in the east was going from black to the deep gray that comes before any color. "He tried to burn us alive," Hazel said finally quiet, looking at the hurt and standing building. "To get the land. He tried to burn my babies alive over money." She was not crying. She had gone all the way past crying to the still clear place on the other side of it. "I used to think there was a floor under the world, Levi, a place people wouldn't go. I'm 73 years old, and tonight I learned there isn't one." Levi was quiet a moment. Then he said, because she had earned the truth, and because the night had burned the last of his hesitation out of him, "There's a floor. It's just not where most people think it is. And there's a lot fewer people standing on the right side of it Then there ought to be. He looked at the sleeping children. But there's some. You found out tonight there's 47 of them ride motorcycles. He paused. And there was one a long time ago who waited tables at a diner out on Route 9. Hazel turned and looked at him. It was almost light enough now to see his face. And Levi Holden, who had carried it for 40 years and had been sure of it for 2 weeks and had not had the courage to say it until a building burned and showed him there was no time left in the world to be a coward, turned and looked at the small, fierce old woman in the smoke-stained nightgown, and he opened his mouth to finally tell her who he was. And that was the moment a black car turned slow onto Sycamore Street and rolled to a stop at the far curb, and the back window came down, and Marshall Decker looked out at the building that had stubbornly refused to burn, and at the old woman and the children who had stubbornly refused to die, and at the mountain of a biker sitting beside her on the curb, and his round, soft face under the streetlight was not afraid at all. It was annoyed. It was the face of a man recalculating a line item. He did not say a word. He did not have to. The look said all of it. This isn't over. I have more money than you have time. I will simply do it again, and slower. And you will lose anyway because you always lose people like you. That's what makes you people like you. Then the window slid back up, and the black car pulled away into the gray dawn. And Levi Holden sat on the cold curb beside Hazel Mercer and understood that pulling 3 children out of a fire had not won anything. It had only made Marshall Decker angry. The real fight, the one that would decide whether Hazel kept her home or lost everything Roy had given his life to keep, had not even started yet. And it was not going to be won with fists or with motorcycles or with 47 men in leather. It was going to be won, if it could be won at all, in the daylight, in front of the whole city, where a thing only stays buried as long as nobody with the nerve drags it up into the light. He told her 3 days later in the daylight, the way it should be told. The building was uninhabitable for a while, the lower floors a ruin of smoke and water, and the Red Cross had put most of the families up in a motel out by the highway. But Hazel had refused to go far, and so Levi had quietly arranged for her and the children to stay in the empty apartment over the Iron Saints clubhouse, a clean, spare place that one of the brothers had once lived in. And the men had filled the refrigerator and brought the children's things, and a dozen hard-handed bachelors had discovered they would walk through fire, literally now, for an 11-year-old who sang hymns and an 8-year-old who'd hired an army with $1. It was a Sunday afternoon. The children were down in the clubhouse lot, learning to wash the bikes, which was to say, getting soaked and laughing for the first time since the fire, and Levi and Hazel sat on the little balcony of the apartment with 2 cups of coffee going cold between them. And Levi finally said the thing. "You showed me a photograph," he said. "The first day. The girl at the diner. Grace's out on Route 9. "I remember," Hazel said. "I've been in that diner." Levi turned his coffee mug slowly in his huge, scarred hands, and he did not look at her because he could not, yet. "Once, November of 1981. I was 21 years old, and I was the worst thing you ever saw, ma'am. I want you to understand that before I say the rest. I just come out of 18 months in the county jail. My mother had died while I was inside, and nobody told me till it was over. I had no people. I had no money. I had a stolen car and a gun in the glove box and a head full of nothing but the next bad thing, because the next bad thing was the only future I could see." He drew a breath. "That night I was driving nowhere on Route 9 in the cold, and I stopped at that diner because I had $4, and I was going to get warm and get fed. And then I was going to drive to a man's house who'd done me wrong, inside, and I was going to use that gun. That was the plan. That was the whole of my plan for my one life. I was 21, and I had already decided I was done being a person and was going to be a weapon instead. You understand that's who walked into Grace's diner at near midnight, soaking wet and stinking of jail, with a gun in the car and murder set in his heart." Hazel had gone very still. "And there was a waitress on the late shift," Levi said. "Young thing. Couldn't have been but 20 herself. and the place was empty except for me and every other soul in the world that whole year had looked at me and gone cold and careful and afraid the way you look at a dangerous dog. Cops, judges, the guards inside, the people on the street, everybody. For 2 years, not one person had looked at me like I was a man. They looked at me like I was a thing that might bite. His voice had gone rough. And this girl, this little waitress, she brought me coffee I couldn't pay for, and she sat down across from me, sat right down in the booth like I was anybody, and she looked me dead in the eye, chin up level, not 1 ounce of fear in her, and she said, "You look like a man who's about to do something he can't take back." Across the small balcony, Hazel Mercer's hand had risen slowly to her mouth. "I didn't say anything," Levi went on. "Couldn't. And she just kept looking at me, kind as you please, and unafraid as God. And she said, 'I've got a brother, could have been you. Drink your coffee, eat something. And then before you go and do whatever's got your jaw set like that, you ask yourself one thing.' And I said, 'What?' And she said," Levi stopped. His voice had finally broken the great gravel rumble of it cracking clean down the middle, and a single tear ran into the gray of his beard. The first he'd let fall in front of another person in more years than he could count. She said, "You ask yourself who's going to be sad, because somebody always is. Even for a man who thinks he's got nobody. Somewhere there's somebody who'd be sad, and they don't even know yet they're about to be. Don't do that to them, son. Whoever they are, don't." The clubhouse lot below them was full of children's laughter and the hiss of a hose. And on the balcony, 2 old people sat in a silence that had 40 years in it. "I didn't go to that man's house," Levi said quietly. "I sat in that booth till dawn. She kept the coffee coming, and she didn't say another word, and she didn't make me leave. And when the sun came up, I drove that stolen car to the sheriff's lot and left it there with the keys in it and the gun in the glove box. And I walked away, and I started that morning the long, slow, miserable business of becoming a man instead of a weapon. Took me years, took me a brotherhood, took me more falling down than I can tell you. But it started in a booth at Grace's Diner because one girl wasn't afraid of me when she had every right to be and asked me who'd be sad. He finally turned and looked at her, this enormous, ruined, weeping mountain of a man, and his eyes were full. I never knew her name. I looked for that diner once years later, and it was gone, and I figured she was gone too, into whatever life she went and made. I have thought about her every single day for 40 years, ma'am. Every day. There has not been a day of my life since 1981 that I didn't owe to a girl whose name I never learned." His voice dropped to almost nothing. "And then a little boy hired me with $1, and I walked his sister home, and I climbed a set of porch steps, and an old woman looked up at me with her chin held level and not 1 ounce of fear in her, and I have spent every minute since trying to be sure, because I couldn't believe God would be so kind. Hazel, it was you. The girl in the booth, it was you." For a long moment, Hazel Mercer did not move, and then her face crumpled, and she reached across the little table and took both of his enormous, scarred hands in her small ones, and she held them, and the tears came down her creased face, and she said in a voice gone high and thin and amazed, "I remember you." She laughed through it, a watery, broken laugh. "Lord help me, I remember you. The boy in the booth. I went home that morning and I told Roy I'd only just started courting. Roy, I told him I'd met a boy that night who broke my heart, who had the deadest eyes I ever saw. And I didn't know if anything I said had reached him. And I prayed for you, you stubborn man. I prayed for that nameless boy for years. I asked God to let me know someday whether it took." She gripped his hands tighter, and her gray eyes blazed up at him, level and unafraid, and 40 years older and exactly the same. "And here you are, come back to me with gray in your beard and 47 brothers to pull my babies out of a fire." She shook her head slowly, undone with the size of it. "It took, Levi. Oh, it took. Look at you. It took." And Levi Holden, president of the Iron Saints, 6'4" and 260 pounds of scar and gristle, and 40 years of the long, hard road back, bowed his great gray head over the small, worn hands of the woman who had once told a murderer to ask himself who'd be sad. And he wept, and she let him. And below them, the children laughed in the November sun. The debt was named at last. And a named debt to a man like Levi was a thing that would be paid in full or in blood, and he had every intention now of paying it in full, in daylight, where the whole world could watch Marshall Decker learn that some old women have stronger friends than money can buy. It is a strange thing about evil that it is almost always lazy. Marshall Decker had spent 15 years building his web of shell companies and bought inspectors and disposable, desperate boys precisely because he believed no one would ever do the work of unstacking it. The poor were tired, the law was busy, the neighborhood was afraid. He had built his whole empire on the safe assumption that nobody who could hurt him would ever bother to try. He had never once, in all his careful years, reckoned with what happens when a man with nothing better to do and 47 brothers and a 40-year debt to repay decides to do the work. They did the work. Book's nephew at the recorder's office, no longer asking for gas money, now a man with a cause, pulled every filing and laid the chain of ownership bare every nested company, unstacked down to the single name at the bottom. The gas can man, looking at serious prison time, did exactly what desperate hired men always do when the boss who promised to protect them is nowhere to be found. He talked, and he gave the police the call log on his phone, and the call log led to a burner, and the burner, with a warrant the arson had finally made possible, led close enough to Decker's organization to matter. Inspector Pruitt, confronted by Book's nephew with the side-by-side proof of the violations he'd invented at Sycamore Court, and waved at Decker's own buildings, and offered the choice between being the man who took the whole fall or the man who helped made the only smart decision of his crooked career and turned. And Brett Slater, 17 years old, and finally on the right side of the floor, sat in a room with a detective and a lawyer, and Levi Holden in the corner with his arms folded, and he told the truth, all of it, every word he'd heard, every cash envelope, every instruction, the whole architecture of the squeeze, in a flat, steady voice that did not once ask for mercy for himself. But the piece that turned it all from a zoning fight into the end of Marshall Decker was the lawyer. Levi found her through a brother whose sister-in-law had once worked legal aid, a sharp, tired woman named Margaret Vaughn, who had spent 30 years suing slumlords and developers on behalf of people who could not pay her, and who took one look at the stack of paper the Iron Saints brought to her cramped office and went very quiet for a long time, and then looked up over her reading glasses and said, "Do you understand what you have here?" "Tell me," Levi said. "You have a valid recorded 50-year-old testamentary trust, granting your client's family a 49% undivided interest in the property," Margaret Vaughn said, "which means the condemnation proceeding is fraudulent on its face, because you cannot condemn your way around a co-owner who never consented and never will. You have a city inspector willing to testify the violations were invented. You have an arsonist's phone records. You have a teenage witness to the extortion scheme. And you have," she tapped the file on Tom Mercer, "a 14-month-old fatal single-car accident of a man who had just discovered this very ownership interest and consulted a lawyer who also represented Marshall Decker, an accident that was closed without an inquest." She took off her glasses. "Mr. Holden, separately, these are problems for Mr. Decker. Together, they are the kind of thing that ends a man. The condemnation hearing is Thursday. He scheduled it to be a formality, a rubber stamp to empty the building. I think we should let him have his hearing." A thin, hard smile. "I think we should let him have it in front of as many people as we can possibly fit into that room." So they planned it for the hearing. The word went out through the east side the way water goes downhill fast, and finding every channel. The condemnation hearing for Sycamore Court would be Thursday at 7 in the evening in the city council chambers. And it was a public hearing, and the public was invited, and the public this time was going to come. Whitlock from 2A made calls. Rachel from 1B made calls. The families who had been driven out, the Okafors and the others, were found and told, and they came back to stand with the ones who'd stayed. The cafeteria where Hazel had cooked for 26 years emptied itself of grown men who remembered her hot lunches in their hard childhoods. And the Iron Saints put out their own kind of word, the kind that travels on chrome to every chapter in every allied club in 3 counties. "How many you figure?" Wire asked Levi the night before in the clubhouse. "Doesn't matter how many," Levi said. "Matters that it's the right ones." But, he thought about it, more than the alley, more than the fire, this is the one where it ends. I'd say everybody who can ride is going to want to be in that room. It was 64 in the end. 64 Iron Saints in Allied riders, though again the number grew in the telling until people swore it had been 100. They did not come to threaten anyone. That was the whole point, and Levi made it crystal clear to every man before they rolled. No patches turned the wrong way, no trouble, no menace. You sit, you stand quiet, you are witnesses and nothing more. Because we are not winning this with fear. We are winning it with the truth in the light, and the only muscle we are bringing is the muscle of every honest person in this county standing in one room, refusing to look away. We are going to do the one thing Marshall Decker never planned for. We are going to make him do it where everyone can see. Levi went to see Hazel the night before the hearing. He found her at her kitchen table with the pine box in front of her, and Roy's reading glasses set out beside it, though Roy had been gone 2 years, and the glasses helped no one now, and he understood without being told that she had taken them out the way she still set out the coffee mug, because the hands do what the heart cannot say. The children were asleep. The apartment was quiet in the particular way a place is quiet when the people in it have already lost more than they can afford to lose, and are bracing to find out whether they will lose the rest. He sat down across from her, and he did not offer her comfort because she was not a woman who wanted comfort. And he had learned that about her in 3 weeks, the way you learn the shape of a thing by the dark. "You don't have to say anything tomorrow," he told her. "Margaret does the talking. You sit in the front row and you hold that box and you let the whole county look at you. That's all. That's the entire job." "I know what the job is," Hazel said. She turned the brass nameplate on the box so it caught the light. "Roy Mercer. I cooked for half the men who'll be in that room. Fed them when they were boys with holes in their shoes and mothers working doubles. I never once thought it mattered the lunch line, the same gray trays, day after day for 26 years. You think you're just keeping children from going hungry one more afternoon." She was quiet a moment. "And now they're grown and they're coming. Because of trays of food I handed across a counter and forgot about by morning." She looked up at him, her gray eyes level. "Is that what it is, Levi? The whole of it. You do one small kindness and forget it, and 40 years later it comes walking up your porch steps in a leather vest." "That's the whole of it," Levi said. "That's exactly the whole of it. You'd know better than anybody." She almost smiled. Then she put her hand flat on the lid of the box the way you would on a sleeping child's back, and she said, "All right, I'll let them look at me." And that was the last thing either of them said that night, the two of them sitting in the kitchen light with a dead man's glasses between them, gathering the quiet they would need for the morning. Thursday came cold and clear. By 6:30, the city council chambers, which seated maybe 150, were full past the fire code, and the overflow had spilled into the lobby and out onto the steps of the municipal building, and the street outside was a river of motorcycles, parked rank on rank, 64 machines gleaming under the streetlights, and the people of the east side stood among them in their good coats, holding their children's hands. Inside, the families of Sycamore Court filled the front rows. Behind them, shoulder to shoulder, silent and still and enormous, stood the Iron Saints, a wall of leather lining every aisle and every back wall, and the effect of it was not menace at all, but something closer to awe. The way a cathedral is not menacing, but makes you lower your voice anyway. Marshall Decker came in at 5 to 7 with 2 lawyers and his soft, round, confident face, and he walked down the center aisle toward the front, and Levi watched the exact moment the man understood that the rubber stamp hearing he had scheduled was not going to be a rubber stamp. Decker's step faltered. His eyes went over the packed room, the families, the wall of bikers, the news camera that Margaret Vaughn had quietly made sure was present. The old woman sitting straight-backed in the front row in her late husband's barn coat, with a grandchild on either side and a plain pine box in her lap. And for the first time since Levi had met his still cold eyes in the glass tower, something moved behind them that was not annoyance. It was the first faint dawning of fear. He had built everything on the certainty that no one would ever drag it into the light. And the light had come for him anyway, 64 motorcycles worth of it, and a tired legal aid lawyer's worth of it, and a sick boy's brave testimony's worth of it, and most of all, a 73-year-old widow's worth of it, sitting in the front row, holding her dead husband's box, refusing. As she had refused every week since the spring, and as she had refused to a frightened young murderer 40 years before to be afraid. The chairman of the hearing called the room to order. He cleared his throat and read the matter before them. The proposed condemnation of the structure at Sycamore Court as unfit for human habitation. And he asked whether any party wished to be heard. Margaret Vaughn stood up. "Mr. Chairman," she said, and her tired voice carried to every corner of that silent, packed watching room. "On behalf of Mrs. Hazel Mercer and the minor heirs of Roy Mercer, who together own 49% of the property you are proposing to condemn, a fact I think this body will find very interesting, since it appears nowhere in the petition before you, we would like very much to be heard." She picked up her files. "We're going to need a little while, and I'd ask that no one leave, because before we're done tonight, this room is going to learn exactly how the building at Sycamore Court came to be condemned, and exactly who has been hurting the children of the East Side, and exactly what happened on the county road 14 months ago to a young father named Tom Mercer, who made the mistake of reading his own father's will." She turned just slightly so that her words fell directly on the soft, round man going pale in the third row. "It's quite a story, Mr. Chairman. I think everyone should hear all of it. Point." And she told all of it. She did it the way a good lawyer does it, which is the way a stonemason builds a wall. One true heavy thing set carefully on top of the last true heavy thing, until there is something standing that no one can knock down. She put the will up on the screen, old Calder's notarized words, "Men who see only the land," and she watched the room understand that the family being thrown out of Sycamore Court actually owned nearly half of it. She put up the chain of shell companies unstacked at last. Every nested shadow company peeled back to the one name at the bottom, and the room watched Marshall Decker's name appear under all of it. She called Inspector Pruitt, who sat hunched and miserable in the witness chair, and admitted in a voice the whole room had to lean forward to hear, that the violations at Sycamore Court had been invented at Decker's instruction, and that he had waived the identical real violations at Decker's own buildings, and that he had been paid to do both. The chamber made a low sound, at that a collective intake of breath, and somewhere a woman said the Lord's name softly. She put up the arsonist's phone records. She let the detective explain in flat, official language where the calls led. And then she did the thing that turned the room from angry to silent. She called Brett Slater. The boy walked up the center aisle past the wall of bikers, 17 years old, thin and pale in a borrowed clean shirt, and he sat down in the witness chair, and he looked very small, and his mother was not there because his mother was too sick to come. And everyone in that room who knew the family understood why and what it meant. And Brett Slater told them. He told them about the friendly man who'd offered a job. He told them about the cash envelopes and the alley and the instructions. Make sure the building's families know the neighborhood's gone bad for kids. He told them, his voice cracking, about the things he had done to children younger than himself, the backpacks on roofs, the tolls, the fear he had been paid to manufacture. And he did not spare himself 1 inch of it, did not once reach for an excuse, though everyone in that room could see the excuse plain as day. A sick mother and no money, and a predator who knew exactly which desperate family to buy. And then he told them about the phone call he'd overheard, the one about burning the building, and what he'd done with what he heard, which was get on a bus and go to a clubhouse full of men who had every reason to hurt him and tell them the truth instead. When he was done, there was not a dry eye in the front rows, and even some of the hard men along the walls had to look at the ceiling for a moment. And then Margaret Vaughn said quietly, "I have one more matter, Mr. Chairman, and then we're nearly through." And she put up on the screen the last thing, and the room went cold and still. It was Tom Mercer. A photograph of him alive, a young father with his wife and his two small children, and then the dry facts beside it. The date he found his father's will, the date he consulted a lawyer, the name of that lawyer and the name of the developer that lawyer also represented side by side. The date 3 days later that a certain phone call had been made, and the date 2 weeks after that that Tom Mercer's car had left a road he had driven 10,000 times. On a clear, cold night with no other vehicle involved and no inquest held. Margaret Vaughn did not say the word murder. She was too good a lawyer to say it. She simply put the dates up in a row and let them sit there in the silence and let every single person in that packed room do the arithmetic for themselves. And the arithmetic was a thing that once it was in your head, you could not get out again. "We are not asking this body to rule on what happened to Tom Mercer," she said into the terrible quiet. "That's not what this hearing is for, and it's beyond this body's power. But I have provided all of this to the county prosecutor's office, and I am informed they have, as of this afternoon, reopened the matter as an active investigation." She set down her papers. "What we are asking this body to do tonight is very simple. We are asking you to deny this fraudulent petition. We are asking you to refuse to be the instrument by which a man burns and bullies and possibly murders his way to a piece of land. The building at Sycamore Court is not unfit for human habitation, Mr. Chairman. It has been made to look that way on purpose by the very man who filed this petition, and the only thing unfit in this whole sorry business is sitting in the third row." She let that land. "The families want to go home. The law says they can. All you have to do is let them." And then she sat down, and the chairman, looking a little gray himself, asked whether the petitioner wished to respond. Marshall Decker's lawyers were already whispering frantically to him, already gathering papers, already in the posture of men who have realized the building is on fire and are calculating the distance to the exit. But Decker himself sat very still for a moment, his soft, round face slack with the particular shock of a man who has just watched the impossible happen, who has just learned that the assumption his entire life was built on, that no one would ever bother to do the work, was wrong. He looked at the screen with the dates on it. He looked at the families. He looked at the wall of leather lining the room, 64 men standing silent and unmoving witnesses, and nothing more, exactly as Levi had promised. And finally his eyes found the front row and the small old woman in the barn coat with the pine box in her lap, and Hazel Mercer looked back at Marshall Decker with her chin held level and not one single ounce of fear in her. The same look she had given a young murderer in a diner booth 40 years before. The look that said, "I see exactly what you are, and I am not afraid of you." And it was that look, more than the lawyer or the inspector or the boy or the dates, that finally broke him. "I have nothing to say," Marshall Decker said, and his voice came out thin and strange, and he stood up, and he and his lawyers went out the side door of the council chamber fast, not looking at anyone, and the news camera that Margaret Vaughn had made so very sure was present followed him all the way out. The petition was denied that night unanimously. It was in the end almost an anticlimax, the formal vote, a show of hands, the chairman's tired gavel. The real verdict had already been rendered, not by the council, but by the room, by every honest person in that county, standing in one place, refusing to look away, which was the only court Marshall Decker had ever truly been afraid of, and the one he had spent 15 years making sure never convened. When the gavel came down, the chamber did not erupt. It was stranger and better than that. There was a sound that started low in the front rows and spread back through the families and up into the wall of bikers. A sound like the whole room exhaling at once. And then someone began to clap. And then everyone was on their feet. The families and the cafeteria men and the returned exiles and 64 leather-clad riders. All of them on their feet in that municipal room with its bad fluorescent light. And Hazel Mercer stood up in the middle of it, holding her dead husband's box. And Eli grabbed her hand on one side, and June grabbed it on the other. And Levi Holden, standing along the wall where he had promised to be nothing but a quiet witness, found that he could not keep that promise after all, and crossed the room, and the people parted to let him through. And he came to stand behind the old woman and her grandchildren as the whole room thundered his enormous, scarred hand coming to rest on Eli's head, exactly as it had in the alley on the first gray afternoon. And the boy looked up at him, and Levi looked down, and neither one of them said a word, because there was nothing left to say, that the noise of that room was not already saying for them. The prosecutor's investigation into Marshall Decker took the better part of a year. It is the slow way of these things, but the arson alone with the gas can man's testimony and the phone records was enough to put Decker in front of a judge. And once a powerful man is in front of a judge, the way he was always so careful never to be, the other things began to come out the way they always do, once the daylight gets in. The shell companies came apart. The bought officials facing prison gave him up one after another to save themselves. In the reopened file on Tom Mercer, 14 months cold began at last to warm, as files do when someone with subpoena power finally cares enough to pull the thread. It would take time. Justice for Tom would take longer than justice for the building. But it was no longer buried, and a thing dragged up into the daylight does not go back into the ground. Marshall Decker never did empty the east side. The riverfront money came through eventually, as those things do, but it built around Sycamore Court instead of over it, because 49% of a building held in trust by a widow and 2 orphaned children with a tired legal aid lawyer and 64 bikers behind them turned out to be the single most expensive piece of arithmetic Marshall Decker ever did. He had seen only the land. He had never once in all his careful years reckoned with the people standing on it. But that is the law's part of the story, and the law is slow, and this is not really a story about the law. It is a story about what the people did while they waited for the law to catch up, which is the part that matters and the part the leather always hides too well. They rebuilt Sycamore Court themselves. The insurance covered some of it, and Hazel's 49% gave her the standing to force the other ownership, now in receivership, to cover the rest. But money was never the thing that rebuilt that building. The thing that rebuilt it was the Iron Saints, half of whom turned out to hold trades: wire, an electrician, and Diesel, a plumber, and Book, a Finnish carpenter who built kitchen cabinets on Saturdays the way other men golfed. And they came on their days off all through that long winter and into the spring, and they tore out the burned guts of the basement where Roy's old boiler had died, and they put in a new one, and they rewired the floors the fire had reached. And they did it the way Roy Mercer had done everything in that building for 41 years, with their own 2 hands and a stubborn love for the place that had nothing to do with owning it. The neighbors worked alongside them. Whitlock turned out to be a fair hand with drywall. The cafeteria men came on weekends. The Okafors, who had been driven out in the spring and had come back to stand at the hearing, moved back into 3A, and Mr. Okafor, who painted houses for a living, took charge of every wall in the building and would not let anyone help him with the trim, because trim, he said, was a thing you did right or you did not do. Rachel from 1B organized the food, and there was always food all winter. Pots of it, the women of the building feeding the men who were fixing the building. The oldest arrangement in the world, and the one that has held more roofs up than any contractor ever did. And in the middle of it all was Hazel. She was 73 years old, and she had buried a husband and a son and nearly lost her grandchildren to a fire. And somewhere in that long rebuilding winter, Hazel Mercer came back to life. The fight had given her something the grief had taken, a reason to stand up straight, and the standing straight had become a habit again. And by the time the new boiler fired up for the first time in February, and hot water ran through every pipe in Sycamore Court for the first time since old Roy was alive, Hazel was running the rebuilding like she'd once run a school kitchen, feeding everyone, knowing everyone's name, the small, fierce heart of the place, exactly as she had always been. Only now everyone could see it. She had been the one who held the building together all along, before the bikers, before the fire, before any of it. The way she'd held her grandchildren together, and her grief together, and her courage together with nobody watching and nobody helping. The difference now was only that she was no longer alone, and a strong person who has finally stopped being alone is a thing of terrible and beautiful power. Brett Slater's mother got her treatments. That was Levi's doing, quiet the way he did things. The boy had told the truth at the hearing when telling the truth could have buried him, and Levi did not forget it. And the Iron Saints had a fund for hard cases and a reach into the kind of charity care that exists if you know who to ask. And somehow Brett Slater's mother's name found its way onto the right list, and the bus that took her to her treatments 3 times a week was paid for. And the boy who had terrorized an alley because a predator had bought his desperation was given the one thing predators count on no one ever giving the desperate, which is a way out that does not cost their soul. Brett came around the clubhouse sometimes after that awkward and quiet, and the men did not make it easy on him exactly, but they did not make it impossible either. And he learned to change oil and patch tires, and the last anyone heard, he had finished high school, which no one in that boy's life had ever once expected him to do, and was talking about a trade. A man is not just the worst thing he ever did. Levi had told him that on the night of the fire, and Levi had meant it, and Levi had made sure it came true, because that was a debt too, an old one paid forward instead of back, from a young murderer in a diner booth to a frightened boy in an alley. The long chain of people who refused to be afraid, handing the refusal down. And Eli, the Saints had a custom, an old one, that you did not give the patch to anyone who hadn't earned it. And they held to that custom about as strictly as men hold to anything, which is to say they bent it exactly once that spring for an 8-year-old boy who had hired an army with his last dollar. They did it on the day the rebuilding was finished, the day Sycamore Court reopened, and they made a whole thing of it. 64 motorcycles came down Sycamore Street in the spring sunshine, not as thunder this time, but as a parade, slow and gleaming, and the whole east side came out to watch. And they parked in the same double rank along the curb where 47 of them had once made a wall against 4 teenagers. And the families of the building came out onto the new painted stoop. And there was food, of course, there was food, tables of it down the whole length of the block. The biggest gathering that street had seen in 20 years. And Levi Holden knelt down in front of Eli Mercer the way he had knelt down in the gas station on the first gray afternoon, so that his eyes were level with the boys, and he held out a small bundle of black leather. It was a vest, a child's vest made to fit a boy of 8, and on the back, in perfect stitching that Book had done himself with his big, careful carpenter's hands, was a patch. Not the full colors the Saints would never give a child their colors, but their own design, something they had made up just for him. A small set of wings over a single word, and the word was guardian. "You're a protector, Eli," Levi said, his rough voice gone soft. "You were a protector before any of us ever showed up. You took care of your sister when you were the only one there to do it, and when you couldn't do it alone, you weren't too proud or too scared to ask. And asking when you need to is the bravest thing a man ever learns to do, and most men never learn it." He settled the vest over the boy's thin shoulders. "That's what this means. Not that you're tough, that you're a protector who knows how to ask. You're one of us now, and we always come for our own. You understand me?" Eli Mercer, 8 years old, looked down at the patch on his chest, and then up at the mountain of a man kneeling in front of him, and his eyes were brighter than the spring sun on all that chrome. and he threw his thin arms around Levi's neck and held on, and Levi held him back, and June stood beside them with her hand over her mouth, and Hazel stood on the stoop of the home Roy had died to keep, with tears running down her creased face, and her chin held up level and unafraid. And the whole street, 64 bikers and 400 neighbors, made a sound like a held breath, finally letting go. Levi did marry Hazel. People always asked later, the ones who heard the story, whether the biker married the old woman he'd loved across 40 years. And the answer disappointed them, because the answer was, no, it was not that kind of thing. They were both too old and too marked by their own dead to start something like that, and they both knew it, and neither of them wanted it. What they had was rarer and in its way larger. They had a debt that had finally come full circle. A girl who'd saved a boy, and a man who'd come back to save her grandchildren. And what grew between them after that was not romance, but something with deeper roots. The bond of two people who had each, at the worst moment of the other's life, refused to look away. Levi came to Sunday dinner at Sycamore Court every week for the rest of Hazel's life. He sat at her table in the apartment that smelled of coffee and cinnamon, and he ate too much, and he listened to her talk about Roy, and he let the children climb on him, and he was in the way that matters most and has nothing to do with blood family. Roy's chair stayed empty at the head of the table the way it always had, but the table was full, now fuller than it had been in years. And Hazel did not set out Roy's coffee mug by mistake anymore, because she was not living so much in the past that her hands forgot which year it was. The fight had brought her all the way back into the present, where her grandchildren were, where the living were where she belonged. The alley behind the Edsel laundromat never went back to what it had been. You could not have made it go back if you tried. The afternoon coffee gathering on the corner became a permanent thing, a fixture of the block, and the Saints kept two men there at the bus hour for a long while out of habit, and then stopped needing to, because a place that has remembered its own courage does not easily forget it again. And the children of Sycamore Court walked home through that dogleg of brick every day of their growing up, and never once thought of it as a place to be afraid. Somebody nobody ever admitted, who painted the long blank wall of the laundromat that summer, a mural that ran the whole length of the alley. And it was not fancy, and it was not signed, but it showed a row of motorcycles parked like a wall against a gray sky, and a small figure of a boy leading a smaller figure of a girl down a corridor of leather-clad guardians, and over the whole thing in plain letters, 4 words that the whole East Side knew the meaning of by then: the strong protect the weak. People came from other neighborhoods to see it. It is still there. And down at the foot of the new stoop at Sycamore Court, set into the fresh concrete the Saints had poured there, was a small brass plate, and it had been Levi's idea, and Hazel had wept when he showed it to her, and it read, "This building was kept by Roy Mercer, who saw the people and not the land." The man Roy Mercer had been the quiet super who had spent 41 years fixing other people's pipes, and had secretly held the deed that saved them all, finally got 2 years after his death. The thing a humble man almost never gets, which is to be named in brass, where everyone could see for exactly what he was. Hazel touched that brass plate every single time she came up the stoop for the rest of her life. It was, she said once to Levi, the only headstone Roy would ever have wanted, the one that named not where he was buried, but what he had built. The prosecutor's case against Marshall Decker concluded the next spring. The arson and the fraud were the easy part, and they were enough on their own to take the glass tower and the riverfront dreams and the soft, white, confident smile and put all of it behind a wall where Decker discovered the way such men always do, that money buys a great many things, but does not buy back time. And that a man who has spent his life standing on other people has remarkably few people willing to stand under him when he falls. The matter of Tom Mercer took longer, as Margaret Vaughn had warned it would, because a cold case built on dates and a phone call in a creek bed is the hardest kind of justice to make stand up. But the thread once pulled did not stop unraveling. Decker's lawyer, the one who had also been Tom's lawyer, faced the loss of his license, and the threat of prison. And like every other bought man in the whole story, he chose himself in the end and told what he knew, and what he knew was enough. Charges were brought. It was in the papers. Hazel Mercer sat in a courtroom one more time, an old woman in her late husband's barn coat, and heard a prosecutor say in plain official words the things she had known in her bones since the night a police officer told her there had been no other car, that her son had not died by accident, that he had died because he had read a will and asked a question that the man in the chair had ordered it done. It did not bring Tom back. Nothing was ever going to bring Tom back. But Hazel said afterward, sitting at her own table with Levi across from her and Roy's empty chair at the head, that there was a difference between a grief you carry alone in the dark and a grief that the whole world has finally agreed is real, and that the second kind, while it weighed exactly the same, was somehow possible to carry where the first kind had been slowly crushing her to powder for 2 years. To be believed, she said, that was the thing. At the very end, after everything, to be believed. She had given that to a frightened murderer in a diner booth 40 years before, the simple, enormous gift of being looked at and believed in. And now, when she needed it most, the whole long chain of it had finally swung back around and given it to her. Hazel Mercer lived 7 more years. They were good years, the best she'd had since Roy died, full of the rebuilt building and the growing children and the Sunday dinners and the slow, steady weekly fact of Levi Holden ducking his head under her doorframe with a pie he'd bought because he could not bake to save his life. She saw June grow tall and sharp and unafraid, the girl who had sung hymns to 2 babies in a burning building, growing into a young woman who was going to be a nurse, who was going to spend her life, she said, being the person who is not afraid in the room when everyone else is, because she had learned from the best how much that mattered. She saw Eli grow up under the small leather vest he refused to outgrow, kept it folded in his drawer long after it stopped fitting, the guardian patch, a thing he would take out and hold sometimes, the way other boys held trophies. And he grew into a steady, quiet kid with his grandfather's careful hands, always fixing things, always the one who showed up. And when Hazel went, she went easy in her sleep, in the apartment that smelled of coffee and cinnamon, in the home that Roy had kept, and that she had saved an old woman who had outrun the grief that had once tried to crush her and had died instead, surrounded by everything she had refused to let anyone take. June found her in the morning. There was no struggle in her face. Her chin, even then, was level. They buried her next to Roy. And the morning of the funeral, the people of the East Side came out onto their stoops and their sidewalks, because they had heard it coming the way you hear a freight train you can't see, a low rumble climbing and climbing until the windows buzzed in their frames. It was not 64 this time, it was more. Word had gone out the way word goes out on Chrome, and they came from every chapter and every allied club in 5 counties, and from clubs that had only heard the story and had never met a single soul in it, but knew that when an old woman who once told a lost boy to ask himself who'd be sad is put in the ground, you ride for her. You ride loud. You make the kind of thunder that lets the whole world know that somebody is sad, that somebody knew her worth, that she did not go into the ground unmarked and unmourned the way she had once been so afraid of going. They rode behind the hearse all the way to the cemetery in a column that took 11 minutes to pass any single point, and the people on the sidewalks took off their hats, and at the graveside, Levi Holden, grayer now, slower, now stood at the head of the largest gathering of leather that town had ever seen. And he did not give a long speech because he was not a man for long speeches. He said only this. He said that 40-some years ago, a young woman who had every reason in the world to be afraid of a dangerous man had instead sat down across from him and asked him one question, and that the question had saved his life, and that he had spent the rest of that life trying to be worth the saving. He said that she had asked him that night, who would be sad? He said he had not been able to think of a single soul. And then he looked out at the column of riders that stretched back out of the cemetery and down the road and out of sight, and at the families of Sycamore Court standing in their good coats, and at June with her chin held level, exactly like her grandmother's, and Eli with the small, worn vest folded in his jacket pocket because he could not bring himself to leave it home that day. And Levi Holden's rough voice finally cracked clean in half, one last time, and he said, "She asked me who'd be sad. 40 years ago she asked me that and I couldn't name one. Well, Hazel." He looked down at the casket. Look how many. Look how many'd be sad. You did that. Every face here, you put it here. You couldn't get me to name one all those years ago, and look at all of us." And he could not say any more, and he did not have to, because the thunder said the rest of it for him, the way it always had. 60 and 100 and more engines coming alive at once, and rolling away into the spring morning, not a sound of intimidation now, and not a sound of grief either, but a sound of a debt paid in full. A girl who saved a boy, and a boy who came back 40 years later as a mountain of a man to save her grandchildren. The whole circle closed, the whole thing complete. We are taught to look for our heroes in shining armor. We are told they wear capes, that they are beautiful, that they come from somewhere clean. That is the story they sell to children, and it is a lie. And the truest thing this old life ever teaches a person is how big a lie it is. The real ones do not look like that. The real ones are scarred, and they are tired, and they are covered in the ink and the leather that teaches the whole world to cross the street when they come. The real ones have done time, and buried friends, and carried griefs that would break a softer person. And that is exactly why they come when a child holds out $1. Because they know the way only the marked and the broken ever truly know what it is to be the weak one in the alley with no one coming. The real ones are gentle giants, and the gentleness is not the opposite of the giant. The gentleness is what the giant was always for. And the other real ones, the ones the story almost forgets because they are small and old and quiet. The ones like Hazel Mercer, who never threw a punch in her life and saved more lives than any fist ever did. They teach the lesson that holds up the rest, that you do not get to choose the size of the load, only whether you will ask the Lord for the back. That there is a floor under the world after all, and that there are fewer people standing on the right side of it than there ought to be. But there are some, and you can become one any day, in any diner booth, with any frightened stranger, simply by refusing to be afraid of someone the whole world has decided to be afraid of. That family is not the people you were born to. Family is the people who refuse to look away. Sometimes family is a grandmother who will burn before she sells. Sometimes family is a brotherhood of 64 men who will form a wall of steel and leather to make sure 2 children get home safe. Sometimes family is a question asked across a diner table at midnight 40 years ago. A question that finds its way all the way back around to the one who asked it and answers her at last with thunder. Eli Mercer is a grown man now. He keeps the vest. The patch on it still reads Guardian, and he earned it when he was 8 years old with a single crumpled dollar and the bravest thing a person ever does, which is to ask for help when you cannot do it alone. He has a daughter of his own now, and she is small, and the world is still the world, hard and full of alleys. But he has taught her already the only thing his grandmother ever really needed anyone to know, the thing Hazel told a murderer and the murderer carried for 40 years and brought back to her at the end. He has taught her to hold her chin up. He has taught her not to be afraid of the people the world is afraid of. And he has taught her that if she is ever standing in an alley with no one coming, there is a number she can call, and men will come loud as thunder, and they will not ask why. They will only ask where.